Alright guys, finally after a semester of organic chemistry, we're finally going to leap into the biochem stuff that a lot of you all have been waiting on. So in the first couple of videos here, in tonight's video we're going to talk just a little bit about what biochemistry is, and a little bit about major reactions. And don't panic, this is just types of reactions that you need to be able to recognize. And then in the next video we'll talk about some solutions chemistry, just to sort of refresh your memory from your Chem 1 classes. And then we're going to dive right into biochem. So what is biochemistry? Well, essentially biochemistry is we're trying to figure out what is chemically going on, or what is going on at the molecular level that explains what is going on with life. In other words, we're trying to essentially in some way answer the question of how do we have inanimate molecules, okay, that are just chemicals, that are going to basically make up and then regulate living organisms. In other words, how do you get from something like a simple amino acid like alanine here to making up a bacterial cell, or obviously making up something much bigger and much more multicellular than that. And historically speaking, I mean, if you look back, I mean, you'd see some lost concepts like vitalism, which said that, hey, the chemicals that make up life, or organic molecules, they can only come from living organisms. And obviously all of that is disproven now, but at the same time, the fundamental issues of like how are all of these things regulated is still something that's really being investigated, and that's what biochemistry is about. If we look sort of on this grand scheme here of biology, or even of science to some sense, where we're talking about building from the smallest things, atoms, up to much larger things like ecosystems, biospheres. Really, these are switched around. Biosphere and ecosystem should be on the other side of each other there. Let's switch that. Your teacher must have been going crazy there. And then, so we can sort of break those up into the sciences that we sort of know. Like chemistry is sort of on this end of the scale. Biology is largely in the middle, where we're talking about organs and organ systems, organisms and populations. And then we could talk about environmental science down at this end. So when we're talking about biochemistry, we're going to be focusing obviously on the chemistry end of things. And we could even sort of slide this over a little bit maybe and say we're talking more about molecules and cells. And then, of course, the big thing for us in biochem is macromolecules. Big molecules that are usually polymers of hundreds or thousands of other smaller building blocks that make up proteins and lipids and polysaccharides and DNA and all of those things. Those are all macromolecules. And so what those things are, how they're constructed, how they're regulated, that is going to be the bulk of what we're going to try to cover this semester. So to get to those things, we're going to start with a few inorganic precursors, okay? So, and really most living organisms, I mean, these are like the basic building blocks that are going to build up to them, is that carbon dioxide and water. Obviously, that's something that plants are going to take in, animals are going to consume and get some of those things from plants, bacteria, all of those things. Ammonium or ammonia, nitrogen, and then nitrate tend to be our inorganic precursors. We're also going to have a lot of organic things in there as well that we talked about last semester, but we didn't talk about much that was inorganic. From those things, we're going to build what we call monomeric subunits, or the basic building blocks of life. And those include things that you probably learned in biology: amino acids, simple sugars, which are monosaccharides, nucleotides, guanine, adenine, those things are going to make up DNA. Fatty acids and glycerol together, they're going to make up lipids. Those things together are going to make up our macromolecules. And again, these two areas here where we're going to focus a whole lot on this semester. And so those macromolecules are polysaccharides, proteins, nucleic acids, lipids. Those are our four big categories. And for the most part, they're generally speaking polymers. So smaller monomers that are going to build up to polymeric compounds. With the exception of lipids. Lipids technically aren't polymers, but usually since they're pretty big molecules anyway, we're going to sort of consider them. You've got several fatty acids maybe connected to a glycerol to make a lipid. And so we can consider that in some case. And then we have what we call supramolecular complexes, which basically means you're going to take a bunch, you're going to take some of those macromolecules and put them together. So maybe you've got 4 different proteins twisted together, and they're going to together bind up to make one big complex. And then those things are then going to be able to build up to build organelles, and then obviously to cells on beyond that. And that, of course, is what we're going to be doing here in this class. So I want to talk real briefly, and of course take notes on this, or your screenshots or whatever, And I'm not looking that you actually know like all of these structures, because we're going to get into those later in the year, and you'll have to know some of them a little bit more then. But you need to know what these major reactions are. I think I've got 6 of them here listed, and these are, technically speaking, like, this isn't like, oh, okay, this is how we would always classify this as, you know, this kind of chemical reaction. But this is in biochemistry. You'll be reading a text or reading an article, and they'll talk about a reaction that's a cleavage reaction or that's a group transfer reaction. And you want to just sort of have a general idea in your head of what's going on. So a real common one, and this certainly is one that we will see all the time, is a group transfer. Not only will we see group transfers all the time, but we'll see this sort of group transfer all the time. And so if you look at this, okay, what we have here is we've got an ATP molecule. That's what this whole guy here is. And we've got a phosphate group on the end. And what is often going to happen is that phosphate group is going to get broken off and transferred to something else. And so it's going to turn ATP into ADP. You probably remember this happening all the time in biology. And so we've got our glucose becoming glucose 6-phosphate because the phosphate group comes from the ATP onto that sugar. Okay, and so it's a simple example there of just a group of molecules transferring from one place to another. Okay, our next kind of reaction is a real common one in chemistry. That's an oxidation-reduction reaction. Now, it was originally called an oxidation-reduction reaction because it was that oxygen was either being added to something or taken away from something. In reality, it's a lot more complicated than that. What's really going on is that there's a transfer of electrons involved. But you can still a lot of times recognize something as an oxidation or a redox reaction because there was some oxygen added to the scenario. And so if you look at this, that same glucose 6-phosphate that we had in the previous reaction, we add some water to it, we're going to be able to change the ending of it here from the sort of aldehyde ending that it was originally there to a carboxylic acid type ending there. We're going to add an oxygen in there where it was just a hydrogen previously. Okay, so that's a redox reaction. Our third type of reaction is a rearrangement. And a rearrangement typically means that some enzyme has come in and physically moved some of the things around that were already there in that compound. In other words, it didn't necessarily add something to it, but it broke some bonds and then reformed those atoms to have them bond in different places. And so you can see that here. If you're looking at the blue part of each of these molecules, you can see how we go from a glucose 6-phosphate to a fructose 6-phosphate. Obviously, the endings of each are going to be different. You see that there's a shift in where the double bond is, shift in where the OH group is, and that's going to be our difference between glucose and fructose, all because of a rearrangement there. We can also have a cleavage reaction. And a cleavage reaction is pretty much just what it sounds like. Tends to be when we think of something being cleaved, we think of it being cut. And that's exactly what's going on here. And so if we have our molecule here, we're going to break that apart with our pyruvate decarboxylase, which is our enzyme, and that's essentially going to cleave off the carbon dioxide on the end there. And we're going to see a lot of this in other cases. We're going to see glucose get split up into some 3-carbon compounds in many cases as we go throughout the year. And so cleavage just means that some part of it was cut off, and it wasn't cut off and reattached. That would be a rearrangement. It was essentially just cut off and became a separate molecule on its own. Condensation reaction, I mean, this is fundamental for biochemistry. So the example here, we've got 2 amino acids here, and they're going to undergo the bond that you, of course, remember from biology class. And of course, that's a peptide bond, or in chemistry, sometimes we call it an amide linkage, because that's essentially what we're building here is an amide. And of course, you guys know that, whereas a lot of your biology peers wouldn't, because you've been through organic chem, and so you know where the amide is. But essentially, we're going to take off an OH off of one of the amino acids, a hydrogen off the others. That's going to kick off of a water. That's why it's called condensation, because water is going to be produced. And then we're going to get our peptide bond here, or an amide linkage there in pink. And then the final one of our really major reactions that I want to remind you of, because we talked about this pretty extensively last semester in organic chem, is a polymerization reaction. And so we're going to take maybe a relatively simple molecule like ethylene, and we're going to treat it under certain circumstances, and we're going to get some really big molecule like polyethylene. Okay, now in biochem, obviously we're not really worried about polyethylene, but we're going to be really worried about polymerization reactions because most of our macromolecules are polymers. So we've taken, say, a bunch of monosaccharides, a lot of simple sugars, and polymerized them, bonded them together into these long chains, maybe even of several thousand. and to make a big macromolecule, to make a polysaccharide like a starch or something like that. We do the same thing obviously with amino acids. We string them together to make polypeptides, polymers, polypeptides. And then obviously if we string them out maybe even further or link some of those polypeptides together, we've then got our proteins. Okay, so those are our 6 major chemical transformations. Again, don't feel like you have to memorize these exact reactions, but what you want to get in your head is that, hey, this is an example of this sort of thing happening. Okay, so that when you're reading an article and it's talking about polymerization, you know what that is, or when it says there's a cleavage going on, that you can then say, okay, well, I know something's breaking off. Or if it's a group transfer, what's the group and where is it going from what part to what part? All right. So that's our first video for biochem, guys. In the next video, we'll talk a little bit about solutions and remind you about some really unique characteristics of water that maybe you remember from Chem 1, but maybe you don't. Thanks, guys.